Most people do not have a purpose. They have a schedule. They have obligations, preferences, habits, and a general forward momentum that they sometimes mistake for direction. But direction is not the same as purpose. Direction tells you where you are going. Purpose tells you why. And the difference between those two things quietly over years determines the quality of everything. Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz, Birkenau, and Dachau, and later founded the school of psychotherapy he called logotherapy, made an observation that has never lost its force. He wrote that a person can endure almost any how if they have a sufficient why. He had watched people survive the unsurvivable, not through physical superiority, not through luck alone, but through the continued presence of meaning. And he had watched people, with every external advantage, collapse in the absence of it. The difference was not strength. It was purpose. Aristotle spent decades investigating what makes a human life go well. Not comfortable comfort was not his criterion. Not successful by external measures. External measures were insufficient. He wanted to know what it meant for a life to genuinely flourish. He called his answer eudaimonia. It is almost always translated as happiness, but that is misleading. It means something closer to full human flourishing, to living in accordance with your deepest nature, exercising your best capacities in the service of something worth doing. And the Bhagavad Gita, one of the oldest and most enduring philosophical texts in human history, offered its own version of the same teaching through the concept of dharma, your particular role, your specific path, the action that is uniquely yours to take in this particular life, at this particular moment. Not the ideal role, not someone else's role, yours, the one that fits the specific grain of who you are. 3 traditions, 3 different centuries, 3 different civilizations. Athens in the 4th century BC. The battlefield of Kurukshetra, composed sometime between the 5th and 2nd centuries before the Common Era. Vienna and Auschwitz, and post-war Vienna again in the 20th century. And when you place what each tradition discovered beside the others, something emerges that is too consistent to be coincidence. Here is what they agreed on. What is also striking before we reach the specific teachings is that none of these traditions treated purpose as something bestowed by external authority. Not by a god, not by a government, not by a parent's ambition or a society's expectations. Purpose in each tradition emerged from the individual's specific nature and was cultivated through practice and honest self-examination. The tradition provides the framework for the question. The life, this specific life, provides the only possible answer. It is also worth pausing on the historical contexts in which these thinkers were working. Aristotle was writing in the shadow of Alexander the Great's conquests. He had been Alexander's tutor in Macedonia at Mieza and watched the young man he had educated become the most militarily successful individual in recorded history. Conquest, Aristotle observed, was not eudaimonia. Military glory was not flourishing. He was writing partly to ask, if not this, then what? What does a life that is actually going well look like, as distinct from a life that is merely impressive? Frankl was writing in the aftermath of witnessing the worst of what human beings are capable of. He entered Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1942. He lost his parents, his brother, his pregnant wife. He survived 4 camps. He was liberated in April 1945. And what he brought out of that experience was not bitterness, but a clinical question. What was the actual difference between those who survived with their humanity intact and those who did not? The answer he found would change how a generation thought about meaning. First, purpose is not found, it is cultivated. The modern idea that purpose is something you discover, that there is a single correct answer hidden somewhere inside you, waiting to be uncovered through introspection or a personality test, or the right retreat weekend, is not what the great traditions taught. Aristotle was direct. The good life is not found, it is made. Through practice, through the slow accumulation of virtue and skill and genuine engagement with the things that matter most to you. The question is not what you feel called to do. The question is what you are willing to consistently do and become through doing it. Aristotle built the Lyceum in the grove sacred to Apollo Lycaeus, just outside the walls of Athens. He walked while he taught. The peripatetic method from peripatane to walk around was not an eccentricity. It was a philosophy embodied in a practice. Knowledge is acquired in motion, in dialogue, in engagement with the world you are actually inhabiting. The philosopher who sits still and reasons in the abstract misses something essential. You learn about purpose by pursuing it, not by thinking about pursuing it from a distance. Aristotle was also, in his own life, a model of what cultivated purpose looks like. He catalogued the constitutions of 158 Greek city-states. He dissected marine creatures and wrote the first systematic works of zoology the Western world had seen. He wrote treatises on physics, poetry, rhetoric, ethics, politics, and metaphysics. It tutored Alexander at Myesa in Macedonia. All of this was purposeful engagement with the world. The man who taught about eudaimonia was himself practicing it, pouring his particular nature into the things he was most suited to understand. His purpose was legible in the accumulated body of his work. Purpose, in the Aristotelian sense, is not a destination you reach and then inhabit permanently. It is a direction you maintain through daily practice. It grows more specific and more compelling the more you engage with it. The more you work towards something genuinely meaningful, the clearer and more demanding your sense of what matters becomes. Purpose is not the beginning of the work, it is what emerges through it. Aristotle also taught that purpose is inseparable from virtue, from the development of character over time. The person who cultivates courage, practical wisdom, honesty, and genuine care for others is not just a better person in a moral sense. They are a more purposeful one in the most practical sense. Because virtue aligns what you do with who you are. And that alignment, the experience of acting fully from your own nature, is what flourishing feels like from the inside. Second, meaning cannot be assigned from outside. It must be chosen from within. Before the war, Viktor Frankl had been a successful neurologist and psychiatrist in Vienna. His clinic was on Marianengasse in the 9th district. He had already been developing his ideas about the will to meaning, the specifically human drive to find purpose, and was working on a manuscript that articulated this theory when the Nazi deportations began. He knew the deportations were coming. He had a visa to the United States. He chose to stay in Vienna to care for his parents. He lost his place in the visa queue. In 1942, he and his family were deported to Theresienstadt. Frankl lost the first version of his manuscript when he was deported. He sewed the pages into the lining of his coat. They were confiscated at the camp gate. In the camps, he rewrote it from memory on scraps of paper he kept hidden. This was not a nostalgic exercise. It was a deliberate act of meaning creation, the preservation of the intellectual work that had been his purpose, now serving as a tool for his survival. He later said that completing the book after the war was one of the reasons he had stayed alive. Frankl insisted on this against every reasonable objection. Even in the camps, he observed, there were choices, not about what was done to them that was entirely out of their hands, but about how to meet what was done, whether to retain human dignity in conditions designed specifically to strip it, whether to share the last piece of bread, whether to comfort a fellow prisoner or conserve the energy for another hour of survival. These were small choices, but they were the difference, Frankl concluded, between a life that retained meaning and one that had surrendered it. Frankl later described his own survival as organized around a specific internal act. He would summon his wife's face. He did not know whether she was alive or dead, and in fact she had died in Bergen-Belsen, and hold it in his mind during the worst moments. He described the vividness of these internal conversations as more real to him than what surrounded him physically. He was not escaping reality. He was choosing a meaning that reality could not take from him. His wife had become his why, and the why sustained the how. This is not victim blaming. It is the exact opposite. It is the recognition that the one thing no external force, however brutal, however total, can take from a person is their relationship to their own circumstances. The meaning you make from what happens to you belongs to no authority. It cannot be confiscated at the gate. No one can make it for you or take it from you. And what Frankl observed was that people who understood this, however dimly, survived differently, not always physically, but in the preservation of their humanity. Frankl described 3 sources of meaning, the 3 pathways to what he called the will to meaning actualized. The first, what you give to the world through your work and creation. The second, what you receive from the world through beauty, truth, and love. The third and the most philosophically radical, the attitude you choose towards suffering that cannot be changed. The third pathway means that even in the worst possible circumstances, when the first two pathways are closed entirely, meaning is not foreclosed. It is simply located differently. Third, your Dharma is specific. What you are here to do is not what anyone else is here to do. The Bhagavad Gita opens at dawn on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. Two vast armies face each other across the plain of northern India. Arjuna, the greatest warrior of his age, stands in his chariot between them and looks across the field at his enemies. He sees his cousins, his teachers, his grandfather, his uncles. He sees people he loves on the other side of a war he is supposed to win. He lets his bow fall. He tells his charioteer Krishna that he cannot do it, that no victory is worth this cost. Krishna's response, the Bhagavad Gita, 18 chapters, delivered in the space between the armies before the battle begins, is one of the most sustained philosophical arguments for the necessity of individual purpose in the entire history of human thought. The central teaching is this: Arjuna has a dharma, a specific function, a role that is his and no one else's. The question is not whether the battle is convenient or pleasant or free of moral complexity. The question is whether this is his path. And if it is, then abandoning it, however compassionate the impulse, is a deeper failure than the difficulty of walking it. The Gita makes a distinction that cuts through every comfortable excuse we make for living someone else's life. Svadharma versus paradharma. Your own path versus another person's path. The Gita says explicitly, it is better to follow your own dharma imperfectly than to follow another person's dharma perfectly. This is not permission for mediocrity. It is a diagnosis of a very specific misery, the misery of the person who is excellent at something that is not theirs, living a life that fits someone else's template rather than their own nature. You know this feeling. It is specific and recognizable. The grinding sensation of a life lived against your grain, spending the best hours of your days performing a role that fits someone else's idea of what you should be. The specific exhaustion of excelling at the wrong thing. This is not ordinary discomfort, the discomfort that comes with any difficult work. This is the particular tiredness of misalignment. In the Gita's framework, it is a form of violence against your own nature, and it costs more than the alternative. Arjuna's dharma was to fight a war he desperately wished he could avoid. This is worth sitting with. The Gita is not promising that your dharma will be comfortable or that following it will feel like a vacation. Arjuna's path led directly through the most painful thing he could imagine. The teaching is not that your path will be easy. The teaching is that your path, however difficult, will be yours. And the misalignment of someone else's path is a different kind of difficult and a more exhausting one, because it spends the same energy for something that does not build. Fourth, purpose must be larger than personal benefit to sustain a life. Aristotle observed that the human being is a social animal, a zoon politikon, and this is not merely a descriptive observation about our social preferences. It is a claim about the structure of human psychology. We are constitutively oriented toward contribution, toward a good that extends beyond our own skin. The person who organizes their life entirely around their own benefit, Aristotle argued, is not truly flourishing. They are living below their actual nature in the same way that a musician who never plays for anyone is living below what music is for. Frankl confirmed this from clinical observation over decades. The most psychologically resilient people he studied, both survivors of the camps and patients in his post-war Viennese practice, were those whose sense of meaning extended beyond themselves, to their children, to their work and its contribution to others, to a cause, to the future. He was specific. Purpose that is only personal, that serves only me, that ends with me, is too small to anchor a life through the worst storms. The anchor needs to be larger than the boat. The Japanese concept of ikigai is often simplified in the West to a diagram about the intersection of passion and skill. But ikigai, as it is actually lived in the Okinawan villages where the longevity research was conducted, is not a career planning framework. It is a description of embedded purpose, purpose that does not require you to discover yourself or find your calling, because it is already present in the daily fabric of community life. The fisherman who goes out before dawn does not ask whether fishing is his passion. He goes because the village needs fish, and he is the one who knows how. In the traditional Okinawan villages associated with the longevity research, ikigai was not a concept that required articulation. It was a condition that was simply lived. Older people in these communities, people in their 80s and 90s who continued to garden, fish, cook for others, teach what they knew, did not describe their purpose in the language of self-actualization. They described it in the language of belonging and responsibility. I do this because it is needed. I do this because the people around me need me to. This, it turns out, is one of the most powerful anchors a human life can have. The Ikigai research on Okinawan longevity consistently found that the people who lived longest were those whose sense of purpose extended outward to family, to community, to craft, to the natural world they tended. They were not searching for purpose. They were living inside it, day by day, through the accumulated weight of small necessary actions done in the presence of people who depended on them. The purpose did not need to be grand. It needed to be real, specific, and other-directed. Fifth, action aligned with purpose feels different from action that is not. You already know what this feels like. There are moments in your work, in any work, when it is the right work where time changes, where you stop performing effort and start inhabiting it. where the resistance that ordinary tasks require dissolves into something that is effort but does not feel like burden, where the question of whether you should be doing this stops arising entirely. The Greeks called the resulting state eudaimonia. Frankl called it the will to, meaning actualized. The Gita calls it the warrior who fights without attachment to the outcome, fully present in the action itself. Aristotle called this anageia activity that is complete in itself, that is, its own end, rather than merely a means towards some external result. This is different from kinesis, mere motion toward an external goal, which stops being worthwhile the moment the goal is achieved. Anageia is the activity in which you are most fully yourself. The carpenter who loves carpentry is not only producing furniture. They are living their nature, and the living of their nature is the purpose, not the furniture. Frankl described the experience of meaning actualized, what he observed in himself during the years of camp survival and in his patients afterward, as a form of tension that was not unpleasant. He called it no dynamics, the healthy tension between who you are and who you are becoming through your purposeful engagement with the world. It was not the absence of difficulty. It was the presence of something that made the difficulty worth it, the difference between a weight you are forced to carry and a weight you have chosen because the carrying of it is making you something. It does not flow in the trivial sense, not just the pleasant absorption of a distraction that engages you enough to forget yourself. It is the sense, available to anyone doing the work that is genuinely theirs to do, that this is what you are for. Not in a mystical sense necessarily, simply in the sense that the fit is so complete and the engagement so total that the distinction between the doing and the being of the doer disappears. Question and answer become the same thing. You do not need certainty before you begin. You do not need the full picture before you take the first step. Aristotle did not have a completed theory of eudaimonia before he started walking the peripatos. Frankl did not have a finished philosophy of meaning before he chose to stay in Vienna for his parents. The purpose clarifies as you move toward it, not before. Every tradition that examined this carefully agreed on the same thing. The waiting is not preparation. The waiting is the obstacle. The beginning is the answer. The synthesis that emerges when you place these three traditions in conversation is this. Purpose is not a feeling that arrives before action. It is a direction that becomes clearer through action. It is not self-contained. It must extend towards something beyond the self to sustain a life through difficulty. It is not assigned from outside. It must be chosen from within, repeatedly, in the specific conditions you actually face. And it is recognizable, when you are living it, by a quality of engagement that is different in kind from anything else. What would you do if you stopped waiting for permission, or certainty, or the right conditions? What is the thing that calls to you when the noise quiets enough to hear it? Not the thing you feel you should want, but the thing that actually stirs when the surface goes still. That call is not nothing. Every tradition that examined human life carefully, across every century and culture we have discussed here, concluded that it is the most important signal available to you. The question is only whether you are willing to begin. If this reached you at the right time, subscribe. We explore the deepest questions of human existence every week, so you can live yours more fully.